rakkatee rakkina faarsitii. Abjuubii kadhabdeef godhumaa rakkatee. Egaa amma yoomiitti gadadoo ni jiraatti. Garaan koo rakkate rakkina faarsiti. Abjuubii kadhabdeef godhumaa rakkatti. Egaa amma yoomiitti gadadoo ni jiraatti. Cinaachi koo yommuu lafa ga'u waan rafuun se'a. Narrafee firrafne jechuufis ciisa koorran jira. Maqumaa fanciisa maalarrafaa miti. Gaaffii deebii dhabdeet na keessa marmarti. Mee akkamiin ta'a waanan ta'u si dhabee. Rafee bulu yaadusi yaada koonda dhabee.
Today is a special day whereby we have a special program where we're going to take some time to honor singer, songwriter, husband, father, humanitarian and dearly beloved son of the Oromo nation, HACHALU'S, who was assassinated on the 29th of June 2020, 3 years ago today. I asked the question, in your view, how did the assassination of HACHALU impact the Oromo struggle in particular and Ethiopia at large across Facebook and Twitter this past week? And Awal Kasim Tola said on Facebook, his death means the attempt to silence a century-long quest of the Oromo struggle and that the Oromo were caused large psychological distress, referring to his assassination. And on Twitter, Talile Joro said, multiple effects. On the one hand, we Oromo, our hearts were broken due to the loss of our iconic son. On the other hand, it led to a sort of transformation of the Oromo struggle. The struggle for the Oromo cause is heightened and has reached a new level. People across Oromia and the diaspora are honouring and remembering HACHALU in ways big and small, as we have seen happen every year for the last 3 years. As I thought about the best way to share of HACHALU with you today, I was drawn to a narrative that I wrote and will be sharing at the International League of People's Struggles Forum on the African people's response to the global poly crisis held today here in Nairobi. I'll be sharing on how HACHALU in life and legacy responded to the global poly crisis. And I thought to share this same narrative with you today in honor of the legacy of one man whose spirit still illuminates a nation and really a world. To introduce HACHALU, an iconic Oromo musician, arguably the greatest of his time, to you, I will read from Awal Alo's piece, HACHALU Hundesa, a towering musician and an Oromo icon, published on Al Jazeera within a week of HACHALU's death. Born in 1986 in Ambo, a storied city in the Oromia state about 100 kilometers west of Addis Ababa, HACHALU was the fifth son of Hundesa Bonsa, an electricity department employee, and Gudata Hora, a stay-at-home mom. His father wanted him to study medicine, but HACHALU showed little interest in academic studies. From early on, he had a passion for art and music. With the support of his mother, HACHALU honed his craft at a young age while looking after cattle on the outskirts of Ambo. And before I say anything about how he died or who killed him, I think it is far more fitting to speak first of his life and share the historic, cultural and political stories that he as a human being reflects. HACHALU was a Tulama Oromo, and Finfinne, the original name of the place we now know to be called Addis Ababa, and is still the term many Oromos use to refer to the city, is at the very heart of Oromia, and is the ancestral land of the Tulama people, HACHALU's people. Just to give you context, when I say at the heart of Oromia, I mean geographically as much as I mean politically, as we can never divorce geography from politics, whether we are talking about the logic of indigeneity or that of colonialism. Addis Ababa today is one of two chartered cities in Ethiopia, the second being Dire Dawa in eastern Oromia, which means that it is governed by the federal and regional governments. This speaks to a power dispute, which is, in the case of Finfinne, the cultural and political belonging of the city to either the Oromo people or to the Ethiopian Empire. The ownership of Finfinne is one of the long-standing questions of the Oromo liberation struggle. The people of Macha and Tulama spread across much of central and western Oromia, and during repeated conquests by consecutive Abyssinian monarchs starting from the 13th century onward, much of the Tulama people were ethnically cleansed to make space for the industrial, capitalist, exclusionary, eugenics-inspired project that is Addis Ababa. Why I refer to Addis Ababa as so will make more sense as I continue. In 1884, during the well-known Berlin Conference that consolidated the colonial borders of the Africa we know today, Menelik II was represented, and his ambitions to annex Oromia and other nations, including Sidama, Walaita, Benishangul, Gumuz, and more, were supported by other colonial powers, namely the British, because it was going to be much easier to support Menelik and benefit through him than fight him. This became a mutually beneficial relationship when the colonial competitors of the British tried to invade Ethiopia in the 1890s, as the British were Menelik's greatest suppliers of arms to fight off the Italians. Now, HACHALU was a Tulama Oromo, and his music paid homage to his roots when he said in his famed song Malanjira, which is to say, do I even? I don't even. What even is my existence? The very first three words, Gullalen kan Tufa, or Gullale belongs to Tufa, referring to one of the ancestral chiefs, Tufa, of the Gullale clan, who belong to the Tulama Oromo.
Algaloto, Gullalen kan Tufa, Algaloto, Garapichu Turi, Algaloto, Galam Finfinema, Algaloto, Silaka Jalala, Algaloto, Waliram Faganu, Algaloto, Jalano Fagay.
As an African, he is responding to one of the root causes of the poly crisis we face when he supports us to draw the conclusion that through dislocating the ownership of land from the people groups whose cultural practices and intergenerational wisdom is centered on living symbiotically with the land, in order to erect extractivist and capitalist processes on that land, instead we cause devastation. HACHALU was a formidable musician, a unique storyteller both melodically and lyrically, but also politically, releasing music to, as many described in the wake of his assassination, fuel a revolution. Many people begin to talk about the so-called transformation in Ethiopia with Abiy Ahmed, the current prime minister of the country, as a starting point for this transformation that could have been, when this couldn't be further from the truth, and in fact is reminiscent of the way elitist and statist political culture often hijack the revolutionary work of people and erases the labor and political demands of those people in the process. The end of the 27-year tyrannical dictatorship was brought about by a youth-led protest movement that lasted close to 4 years, where in Oromia we lost upward of 5,000 young people to state violence, with tens of thousands detained, with some still in prisons. This movement began as a resistance to what was called the Addis Ababa Master Plan, which was in essence a plan to expand the boundaries of Addis Ababa, resulting in mass evictions of farmers and nomadic and settled peoples from their ancestral lands, and assimilating the mostly Afan Oromo-speaking outskirts of Addis Ababa into the homogeneous cultural eugenicism that is Addis Ababa. And so the resistance began, which in its final days was joined by people across the country, including the Mahara region, to topple the incumbent government that had been there with consecutive 100% election wins for the previous nearly 3 decades. It was at one of the most critical points in this protest movement against the master plan that HACHALU released his song Malanjira, where I described earlier laments the existential conditions of his people who are once again on the verge of erasure. And he does this whilst also reclaiming the geographical, political and historical territory of the Tulama Oromo, and thus all Oromos, that the master plan, like the Abyssinian conquests of the 13th to 18th century, aimed to erase. As this movement continues, he releases a sequel to Malanjira, which is Jira, where he answers the existential question he posed in the title of Malanjira by saying Jirra, which more so is a phrase that is to mean, no matter what you do, I will not be erased. This, with many other songs released by other Oromo artists intending to give the revolution of the moment something to march to, hits the streets and lifts the spirits of the people almost immediately.
Jirra, 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 jirra. Jirra bulle bari arguf, garanu bal'ise yaanui, 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 yaawa irraanfachuuf, yaawa irraanfachuuf, yaawa irraanfachuuf yaanui, yaawa irraanfachuuf yaanui, yaawa irraanfachuuf yaanui, yaawa irraanfachuuf yaanui.
HACHALU, as a musician, was time and time again responding to the global polycrisis in many ways. Using his music as historical archive, he gave a generation of young people a lens through which to view themselves as unlike the state narrative enforced by perpetual and erratic violence. Rather, it conjured up this image of the Oromo in Ethiopia as being a people of history with lineage, a language, and a cultural worldview that should be fought for. His roots as a herder of cattle, where he first started playing with melodies, and his connection with his people as people who cultivate land, gave a lot of his music an anti-capitalist politic wherein he continuously centers the Oromo in relation to their land and in opposition to those trying to steal it for profit. At the age of 17, HACHALU, who was part of the student movement of his time, was imprisoned for 5 years, and this is where he wrote much of his first album. This is, in my view, deeply connected to the way HACHALU embodies a response to the effect of the polycrisis that may be undermined. We must be able to keep our spirits in a state of joy and celebration so that we do not become consumed by the darkness of greed, bitterness, division, and despair, and violence. And his music has the power to inspire light in even the bleakest of moments. I say this as much as a collective reflection as I do as one person who has experienced this effect on my very soul. About his death, I will quote first my comrade Fatuma Badasso, as she wrote in her piece, HACHALU Hundesa Bonsa, A Legacy Larger Than Death, for African Arguments on the first anniversary of his death in 2021. HACHALU's assassination ended up being a catalyst for the state of affairs in Ethiopia today. Not only was he denied a befitting send-off commensurate of his legacy, exacerbating the already frayed Oromo relationship with the Ethiopian state, but the aftermath of his death has seen the near dissemination of dissenting voices, the closure of political space, and the eruption of a brutal civil war in Tigray. We are at a juncture where kidnappings, public executions, disappearances, sexual violence, intercommunal conflicts, and mass atrocities are a daily reality in Ethiopia. We are faced with a humanitarian crisis that could destabilize the wider region and have just witnessed a non-election that has further entrenched political polarization. The precious opportunity to answer the country's existential questions that HACHALU and his comrades opened is now closed. The country is facing an existential threat with no solution in sight. The depth and accuracy of this passage for me is timeless. One of the ways that HACHALU left a legacy upon this question of the African people's response to the global polycrisis was that he awakened a generation of young people who will settle for nothing less than their country free from all the terrors, political, economic, socio-cultural or otherwise of the Ethiopian state, no matter who its leader is or where they come from. The impact of HACHALU's assassination on the individual life of the Oromo did not rest on whether one knew him or not. An entire nation was turned upside down overnight. Throes of young people began to join the Oromo Liberation Army almost immediately, protests erupted across the country, and much more. The question of who killed him really is not about who pulled the trigger, but it is the same question of whom, in ideology and practice, is behind the very same polycrisis affecting all of our homelands. In the context of the Oromo struggle, we identify the main proponent of this polycrisis to be the colonial roots of the Ethiopian Empire and its neo-colonial manifestations. But what it is an ideology of genocide, an ideology of political dictatorship, of economic extraction and abuse. It's an ideology of militarism, of gendered violence, of the prison industrial complex. It's an ideology of death. And if it is an ideology of death that sits at the heart of the African people's polycrisis and the global polycrisis, then Hachalu, an embodiment of Oromumma, unifying 50 million plus people, captivating, whole, warm and unapologetic, reflects the ideology of life.
Ida